Subscribe now and press the bell icon so you never miss an emotional story that touches your heart. The morning sun cast long shadows across the polished marble floors of Buckingham Palace as Captain James Hartford stood at attention. His red uniform was immaculate, every brass button gleaming, his bearskin hat sitting perfectly atop his head. He had served in the Queen's Guard for 7 years, and every single day felt like an honor. The weight of tradition rested on his shoulders, but he wore it with pride. James came from a family of soldiers. His grandfather had fought in World War II, his father had served in the Falklands, and now he continued the legacy. But being a Queen's Guard was different. It was not just about military service. It was about representing something bigger, something that connected the past to the present. Every tourist who took his photograph, every child who stared up at him in wonder, was looking at living history. Today was supposed to be like any other day. The schedule was predictable and comforting. 2 hours on duty, 4 hours off, then back again. Stand perfectly still, eyes forward, showing no emotion. Tourists would try to make him laugh, children would wave, and he would remain as still as a statue. That was the job, and he loved it. But something felt different this morning. Perhaps it was the unusual chill in the air, or maybe it was the letter he had received from his mother the night before. She had written about his younger brother Thomas, who was struggling after returning from Afghanistan. The war had changed him, she said. He was not the same boy who had left home 3 years ago. James had read the letter 5 times, each word cutting deeper. He wanted to help, but he was here in London, and Thomas was back in their small village in Yorkshire. As the morning progressed, James noticed an unusual amount of activity near the palace gates. Security personnel were moving with purpose, and several high-ranking officers were gathered in discussion. Something was happening, but as a guardsman, he was not privy to such information. His job was simple: stand, observe, and protect. Questions were not part of his duties. Around mid-morning, a convoy of black vehicles pulled up to the palace. American flags fluttered from the front cars, and James recognized the distinctive markings of a diplomatic visit. Americans were common visitors, but this seemed more formal than usual. The vehicles stopped, and doors began to open. From the lead car emerged a tall man in a United States military uniform. His chest was covered with medals and ribbons, each one telling a story of service and sacrifice. James could see he was a high-ranking officer, probably a colonel, or perhaps even a general. The man moved with confidence, but there was something else in his stride. It was not arrogance exactly, rather the walk of someone who had seen too much and carried too many burdens. Behind the American officer came several aides and security personnel. They were all business, scanning the area, checking their phones, coordinating movements. The officer himself seemed less interested in the palace and more interested in the guards. His eyes moved from one red uniform to another, studying each face, each posture. James felt the officer's gaze land on him. For a moment, their eyes met, and James saw something unexpected. There was pain there, deep and raw. It was the same look he had seen in veterans at military hospitals. The same expression his brother Thomas wore in recent photographs. This was a man who understood loss. The officer approached slowly. He was not being disrespectful, but he was definitely breaking protocol by coming so close to an active guardsman. James remained perfectly still, eyes forward, but he could see the American in his peripheral vision. The man stood there for what felt like an eternity, just looking, just thinking. Then the officer did something unexpected. He stepped back and stood at attention, offering a proper military salute. It was not a casual gesture or a tourist attempt at humor. This was a real salute, one soldier to another, sign of respect that transcended nations and uniforms. James wanted to return it, but he could not. His duty required absolute stillness. After holding the salute for several seconds, the officer lowered his hand and spoke softly, just loud enough for James to hear. His voice was thick with an American accent, but the words were clear. He said he knew what it meant to stand post, to represent something bigger than yourself, to carry the weight of honor and duty. He said he had done it himself many times. In many places around the world, the officer continued talking, his voice becoming quieter, more personal. He spoke about a young soldier he had commanded in Iraq, a kid from Texas who loved to joke and make everyone laugh. This soldier had volunteered to stand guard one night so another soldier could rest. It was supposed to be a quiet night, but it was not. An attack came, sudden and violent. The young soldier from Texas had held his position, protecting his brothers in arms. But he never made it home. James felt his chest tighten. He understood now why this officer had that look in his eyes. He was carrying ghosts, just like everyone who had served in war zones. Just like Thomas probably was. The weight of survival, the guilt of coming home when others did not, was written all over this man's face. The American officer took a deep breath and straightened his uniform. He looked at James one more time and said something that would change everything. He said that standing guard, whether at a palace or in a war zone, was sacred duty. He said that anyone who truly understood that duty would never take it lightly. Then he did something completely unexpected. The officer asked, in a voice that was somehow both commanding and humble, if there was a place where an old soldier could sit down. Not because he was tired, he explained, but because his legs had been injured years ago in combat, and standing for too long had become difficult. He was supposed to have a meeting inside the palace, but it had been delayed by an hour, and he needed to rest. James, of course, could not respond. He could not move or speak or even acknowledge the request, but something about this moment felt important, felt like it mattered in a way that went beyond rules and regulations. The officer was not asking for special treatment. He was simply one soldier reaching out to another, asking for understanding. The American officer stood there waiting, his eyes still locked on James. Around them, tourists continued taking photographs. Security personnel moved about their duties, and life at Buckingham Palace went on, as it always did. But in this small moment, between two soldiers from different countries, something profound was happening. James had been trained extensively on protocol. Every possible situation had been covered in his training. He knew exactly what to do if someone became aggressive, if someone tried to breach security, if there was a medical emergency. But this situation was not in any manual. This was about human compassion meeting military duty, and the line between them was not clear. The officer's aide stepped forward, looking concerned. He tried to guide his superior away, suggesting they wait in one of the nearby buildings where chairs were available. But the American officer waved him off, insisting he was fine where he was. The aide looked uncomfortable, clearly worried about causing an international incident by bothering a Queen's Guard. James's mind was racing, even though his body remained perfectly still. He thought about his brother Thomas, who had come home from Afghanistan with injuries both visible and invisible. He thought about all the soldiers who had stood guard in dangerous places, who had sacrificed their comfort and safety for others. He thought about the young soldier from Texas that this officer had described, who had died protecting his brothers in arms. The palace had a small bench nearby, positioned along the wall about 15 feet from where James stood. It was not meant for official use, just a decorative piece that added to the palace's aesthetic. No one ever sat on it, because it felt disrespectful, too casual for such a formal place. But it was there, solid and unused. James knew he could not abandon his post. That was absolutely forbidden. A Queen's Guard did not simply walk away, no matter what the circumstance. But he also knew that sometimes the spirit of duty required flexibility that the letter of the law did not account for. His grandfather had told him once that being a good soldier meant knowing when to follow orders and when to follow your conscience. The American officer was beginning to show signs of real discomfort. His weight shifted subtly from one leg to the other, and a slight grimace crossed his face. Whatever injuries he had sustained were clearly causing him pain, but he was too proud to complain or make a scene. James recognized that pride. It was the same pride that kept wounded soldiers from asking for help. The same pride that sometimes made things worse instead of better. A senior British officer emerged from inside the palace, walking briskly toward the American delegation. He was clearly coming to escort them inside for their meeting. James felt a sense of relief. The situation would resolve itself naturally. The American would be taken inside, given a comfortable place to sit, everything would return to normal. But as the British officer approached, the American colonel held up his hand, stopping him. James could not hear the conversation from where he stood, but he could see the exchange. The American was explaining something, gesturing toward James, then toward the bench. The British officer looked confused, then concerned, then thoughtful. The British officer walked over to James. This was highly unusual. Supervisors did not normally approach guards during their duty unless there was an emergency. The officer leaned in slightly and spoke in a low voice that only James could hear. He said the American colonel had specifically requested that James be given a brief break, and that he was offering to take James's place at the post. James was stunned. A visiting American officer wanted to stand guard at Buckingham Palace so that a British guardsman could rest. It was unprecedented, probably against numerous protocols, and definitely not something that happened in the normal course of events. The British officer seemed equally surprised but also intrigued by the idea. The officer explained further. The American colonel had served in joint operations with British forces in Iraq and Afghanistan. He had deep respect for the British military and had always wanted to stand alongside the Queen's Guard, even if just for a few minutes. He saw this as an opportunity to honor that connection while also showing respect to a fellow soldier who had been standing at attention all morning. James wanted to refuse. His pride told him that he did not need special treatment, that he could stand his post for the full duration of his shift without difficulty. But something else spoke louder than his pride. It was the memory of his brother's letters from Afghanistan, describing how small acts of kindness between soldiers from different countries made unbearable situations slightly more bearable. It was the understanding that sometimes accepting help was its own form of strength. The British officer was waiting for a response. James gave the slightest nod, so small that only someone watching very carefully would notice it. That was all the confirmation needed. The officer stepped back and spoke briefly with the American colonel, who immediately straightened up, all signs of discomfort vanishing from his face. What happened next became the subject of countless photographs and videos that would circulate around the world within hours. The American colonel removed his service cap and approached James's position. The British officer temporarily relieved James, who stepped aside, his movements precise and controlled despite the unusual circumstances. The American colonel took the position, standing at attention where James had stood. He did not have the red uniform or the bearskin hat, but he had something else, the unmistakable bearing of a soldier who understood what it meant to stand guard. His posture was perfect, his gaze forward, his presence commanding. James walked to the bench and sat down. It felt strange to be sitting while on duty, to be watching someone else stand his post. But as he watched the American colonel, he felt something unexpected, a profound sense of connection. This was not about one person replacing another. This was about solidarity, about the understanding that exists between soldiers. Regardless of nationality or uniform, tourists began to notice the unusual situation. Cameras clicked, people whispered to each other, trying to understand what they were seeing. An American officer in a regular military uniform standing guard at Buckingham Palace was certainly not something you saw every day. Security personnel watched carefully, ready to intervene if anything went wrong. But the American colonel was perfect in his execution. James sat on that bench for exactly 5 minutes. In that time, he thought about everything that had led to this moment. He thought about his grandfather's stories of British and American soldiers fighting side by side in World War II. He thought about his father's tales of international cooperation during the Falklands War. He thought about his brother Thomas, serving with American units in Afghanistan, forming bonds that transcended national boundaries. As James sat watching the American colonel stand in his place, he noticed details he had never paid attention to before. From this angle, sitting rather than standing, the palace looked different. He could see tourists more clearly, families with children pointing and taking pictures, elderly couples holding hands as they admired the architecture. He had been part of this scene for 7 years, but he had never really seen it from this perspective. The American colonel remained perfectly still, just as James had been trained to do. Despite his earlier discomfort and the pain in his legs, the officer showed no sign of weakness now. This was pride of a different sort, not the stubborn pride that refused help, but the professional pride that said once you accepted a duty, you performed it with excellence. A small girl, perhaps 6 or 7 years old, broke away from her parents and ran toward the colonel. Her mother called out, trying to catch her, but the girl was determined. She stopped right in front of the American officer and looked up at him with wide, curious eyes. James tensed, ready to intervene if necessary, but the colonel handled it perfectly. He did not move or speak, maintaining the traditional guardsman discipline. But there was a softness in his eyes that the little girl seemed to understand. The girl waved at the colonel, then carefully placed a small flower at his feet. It was a simple gesture, innocent and pure, the kind of thing children do without thinking about protocol or rules. The girl's mother rushed over, apologizing profusely. But the British officer supervising the situation simply smiled and nodded, indicating it was fine. James watched this exchange and felt his throat tighten with emotion. This was why they did what they did. Not for the glory or the prestige, but for moments like this. For little girls who believed in heroes, for families who traveled thousands of miles to witness history, for the preservation of traditions that connected generations. The 5 minutes passed quickly. The British officer approached James and gave a subtle signal. It was time to resume his post. James stood, straightened his uniform, and walked back to his position. The American colonel stepped aside, and for a brief moment, the two men stood face to face. The colonel extended his hand, breaking protocol once more, but doing so with such genuine warmth that it felt entirely appropriate. James shook his hand, their eyes meeting in silent understanding. No words were exchanged, but none were needed. In that handshake was recognition, respect, a shared understanding of what it meant to serve. As James resumed his position, the American colonel picked up the flower the little girl had left. He examined it carefully, then turned and walked back to his delegation. James noticed the colonel slip the flower into his pocket. A small treasure from an unexpected moment. The British officer approached James once more and spoke quietly. He said that what had just happened would probably be talked about for years to come. It was unusual, definitely outside normal protocol, but it was also something special. He said that sometimes the most important moments in military service were not the big battles or formal ceremonies, but the small acts of humanity that reminded everyone why they served. James returned to his duties, standing at attention as he had been trained, but something had changed. He felt lighter somehow, as if a weight he had not known he was carrying had been lifted. The rest of his shift passed normally, tourists taking photos, children waving, life continuing its usual pattern. But inside, James was different. When his shift ended and he was finally able to relax, James returned to his quarters and immediately wrote a letter to his brother Thomas. He told him about the American colonel, about the conversation, about standing guard and giving up his post. He wrote about the flower the little girl had left, about the handshake, about understanding that accepting help was not weakness. James wrote that he finally understood what Thomas might be going through. Coming home from war meant carrying invisible wounds, and sometimes those wounds made it hard to accept help from others. But just as James had accepted the American colonel's offer to take his post, Thomas needed to accept the help available to him. There was no shame in it. In fact, accepting help was often the bravest thing a soldier could do. The letter took James over an hour to write. He revised it several times, trying to find the right words to express what he felt. When he finally sealed the envelope and addressed it, he felt a sense of relief. He had been wanting to reach out to Thomas for months, but had not known what to say. Now, thanks to an unexpected encounter with an American officer, he had found his voice. That evening, James learned more about the American colonel. His name was Colonel Michael Harrison, and he was a decorated officer who had served multiple tours in Iraq and Afghanistan. He had been injured during a rescue operation that saved the lives of 7 soldiers, both American and British. The injuries had ended his combat career, but he continued to serve in diplomatic and advisory roles. Colonel Harrison had specifically requested to visit Buckingham Palace during his trip to London. According to his aides, he had always been fascinated by the Queen's Guard, and saw them as symbols of dedication and tradition. The encounter with James had been unplanned, but the colonel had been moved by something he saw in the young guardsman's eyes. Word of the incident spread quickly through the military community. Some officers questioned whether proper protocol had been followed. Others praised the spirit of international cooperation it demonstrated. The palace officials held a quiet meeting to discuss whether any rules had been violated, but ultimately decided that the incident, while unusual, had been handled appropriately. Several news outlets picked up the story after tourists posted their photos and videos online. The images of an American colonel standing guard at Buckingham Palace, while a British guardsman sat nearby, became viral sensations. People around the world commented on the photos, sharing their own stories of international military cooperation and friendship. James found himself unexpectedly famous. Reporters wanted to interview him, people recognized him on the street, and his commanding officers were unsure whether to reprimand or commend him. Through it all, James remained focused on what mattered: his duty, his service, and his family. 3 days after the incident, James received a response from his brother Thomas. The letter was longer than any Thomas had written since returning from Afghanistan. He wrote that James's story had affected him deeply. He had been refusing to attend support group meetings for veterans, believing that asking for help would make him appear weak. But reading about James accepting help from the American colonel had changed his perspective. Thomas wrote that he had attended his first support group meeting the day after receiving James's letter. He described how difficult it was to walk through those doors, to admit that he needed help, to sit among other veterans and share his struggles. But he also wrote about the relief he felt, the understanding he found in others who had been through similar experiences, and the hope that maybe, just maybe, things could get better. James read his brother's letter 3 times, tears streaming down his face. This was what mattered. Not the viral photos or the news coverage or the debates about protocol. What mattered was that one small act of accepting help had rippled outward, touching his brother's life in a meaningful way. Sometimes the most important battles were not fought with weapons, but with vulnerability and courage. A week after the incident, James received an unexpected package. It was from Colonel Harrison, sent from the United States. Inside was a formal letter written on official military stationery, thanking James for his service and his willingness to participate in what the colonel called a moment of genuine military brotherhood. But there was something else in the package. It was a photograph, professionally printed and framed. The image showed the colonel standing at James's post, with James visible in the background sitting on the bench. But what made the photograph special was what the colonel had written on it. The inscription read, "To Captain Hartford, who understood that true strength lies not in never needing help, but in having the wisdom to accept it. With respect and gratitude, Colonel Michael Harrison." Attached to the photograph was a smaller picture. It showed a young soldier in American uniform, smiling broadly at the camera. On the back, Colonel Harrison had written, "Specialist David Martinez, Texas, lost in Iraq 2007. He taught me that standing guard for our brothers is the highest honor. Thank you for standing guard with me." James understood now. The colonel had not been asking for a favor out of physical necessity alone. He had been honoring the memory of Specialist Martinez, the young soldier from Texas who had died standing guard. By taking James's post, the colonel was keeping a promise to never forget, to continue standing guard in spirit for all those who could no longer stand themselves. James placed the photograph on his desk in his quarters. Every morning before heading to his post, he would look at it and remember why he served. He would think about Colonel Harrison, about Specialist Martinez, about his brother Thomas, and about all the soldiers throughout history who had stood guard so others could rest safely. The incident changed James in subtle but profound ways. He still performed his duties with the same precision and dedication, but now there was an added layer of understanding. When tourists photographed him, he thought about the little girl who had left a flower. When his legs grew tired from standing, he thought about Colonel Harrison pushing through pain out of respect and duty. When he felt isolated in his role, he remembered that he was part of a global community of soldiers who understood sacrifice. His relationship with his brother Thomas deepened significantly. They began writing to each other regularly, sharing their struggles and victories. Thomas continued attending support group meetings and even started volunteering to help other veterans. Transition back to civilian life, he wrote that helping others helped him, that standing guard for his fellow veterans gave him purpose again. James also started paying more attention to the other guards he served with. He noticed that several of them seemed to be struggling with personal issues, but were too proud or too afraid to ask for help. Using his own experience as an example, James began organizing informal gatherings where guardsmen could talk openly about challenges they faced, both on duty and off. These gatherings were not official military functions. They were simply soldiers supporting soldiers, creating a space where it was safe to be vulnerable, where asking for help was seen as strength rather than weakness. The idea caught on, and soon similar groups were forming throughout the Queen's Guard units, the palace. Officials noticed the positive change in morale among the guards. Performance remained excellent, but there seemed to be a stronger sense of camaraderie, a deeper connection between the soldiers. When asked about it, James simply said that sometimes people needed to remember they were not alone, that accepting help and offering help were two sides of the same coin. 6 months after the incident with Colonel Harrison, James was promoted to lieutenant. During the promotion ceremony, his commanding officer specifically mentioned the incident at Buckingham Palace. He said that James had demonstrated not only military discipline, but also wisdom and humanity. He said that the best soldiers were those who understood that strength came in many forms, and that sometimes the bravest thing you could do was show vulnerability. James stood at attention during the ceremony. He was proud but also humble. He thought about how much his life had changed from that single morning when an American colonel had asked to take his post. He thought about the chain reaction of positive events that had followed: his letter to Thomas, his brother's recovery, the support groups, and now this promotion. After the ceremony, James called his brother to share the news. Thomas was thrilled and said he was planning to visit London soon. He wanted to see James in his new role and maybe even visit Buckingham Palace to see where the famous incident had occurred. James was excited about the visit. It would be the first time they had seen each other face to face since Thomas returned from Afghanistan that evening. James received an email from Colonel Harrison. The colonel had heard about the promotion through military channels and wanted to offer his congratulations. He wrote that he had been following James's career with interest and was impressed by the positive changes James had implemented within his unit. He said that true leadership was not about giving orders, but about understanding people and creating environments where they could thrive. The colonel also shared an update about himself. He had been working with a program that brought together American and British veterans for joint support activities. The program was still small, but it was growing, and the colonel credited James's story as part of the inspiration for expanding it. He said that the incident at Buckingham Palace had reminded him that borders and uniforms were less important than the shared human experiences that connected all soldiers. James began corresponding regularly with Colonel Harrison. Their emails covered various topics, from military strategy to personal struggles, from philosophical questions about duty to practical advice about helping veterans. A genuine friendship developed between them, built on mutual respect and shared experiences. The colonel told James more about his time in Iraq and Afghanistan. He described operations where British and American forces had worked seamlessly together, each bringing their own strengths to complex situations. He talked about soldiers from both countries who had become like brothers to him, some of whom had not made it home. Each story added depth to James's understanding of what military service truly meant. James shared his own experiences, both the highlights and the challenges. He talked about the pressure of standing guard under constant scrutiny, the weight of representing centuries of tradition, and the personal struggles he faced when trying to balance military duty with family concerns. The colonel listened, offering wisdom gained from decades of service, and never judging or dismissing James's concerns. Through these conversations, James began to develop a broader perspective on military service. He realized that while the specifics of their duties differed dramatically, the core principles remained the same. Whether standing guard at a palace or leading troops in combat, soldiers everywhere grappled with questions of duty, honor, sacrifice, and humanity. When Thomas finally visited London, it was an emotional reunion. James barely recognized his brother at first. Thomas had gained some weight. His eyes were clearer, and most importantly, he smiled genuinely. The change was remarkable, and their mother had been right to be concerned months earlier. Without intervention and support, Thomas might not have recovered. James took Thomas to Buckingham Palace on a day when he was not on duty. They stood together where the incident with Colonel Harrison had occurred. James pointed out exactly where he had been standing, where the colonel had taken his place, where the bench was that he had sat on. Thomas listened intently, asking questions, trying to imagine the scene. Thomas said that when he first read James's letter about the incident, he had been angry. He felt that James was trying to tell him he was weak, that he needed to admit defeat. But then he read it again, and he understood. James was not calling him weak. James was saying that they were both strong enough to accept help when needed, that this acceptance was actually a form of courage. The brothers spent several days together in London. They visited military museums, attended a ceremony honoring fallen soldiers, spent long evenings talking about their experiences. Thomas shared details about Afghanistan that he had never told anyone, and James listened without judgment. In return, James talked about the loneliness that sometimes came with his role, the pressure to be perfect, and his fears about the future. On Thomas's last day in London, something unexpected happened. Colonel Harrison was in town for another diplomatic meeting, and he reached out to James asking if they could meet in person. James immediately agreed and asked if Thomas could join them. The colonel said he would be honored to meet James's brother. They met at a small cafe near the palace. Colonel Harrison arrived in civilian clothes, looking more relaxed than he had in his formal uniform. He greeted James warmly, then turned to Thomas and shook his hand with obvious respect. The colonel said he had heard a great deal about Thomas, and was grateful for his service in Afghanistan. The three men talked for hours. The colonel shared more stories about his own struggles after returning from combat, about the difficulty of readjusting to normal life, about the guilt of surviving when others had not. Thomas listened carefully, occasionally nodding in recognition of shared experiences. James watched both of them, grateful that this meeting was happening. The colonel talked about Specialist Martinez, a young soldier from Texas, whose memory had been part of why he asked to take James's post. He described Martinez as someone who always put others first, who volunteered for the dangerous assignments, who kept spirits high even in the darkest moments. The colonel's voice broke slightly as he explained how Martinez's death had devastated their unit and how he still thought about him every single day. Thomas shared his own story about a British soldier named Andrew who had saved his life during an ambush in Afghanistan. Andrew had pulled Thomas to safety while under heavy fire, taking a bullet in the process. Andrew survived, but was medically discharged due to his injuries. Thomas said he felt tremendous guilt about it, that Andrew had sacrificed his career to save him. The colonel leaned forward and looked directly at Thomas. He said that survivor's guilt was one of the hardest things to overcome, that every veteran he knew who had seen combat struggled with it. But he also said that the best way to honor those who sacrificed was not to waste the life they had saved. He said Andrew had made a choice, a brave choice, and the way to respect that choice was to live well, to help others, then to never forget. James watched his brother's face as the colonel spoke. Something shifted in Thomas's expression, a release of tension that had been visible since he arrived in London. Thomas nodded slowly, tears forming in his eyes. He said he had never thought about it that way before, that he had been so focused on his guilt that he had forgotten to honor Andrew's choice by living fully. The conversation continued, ranging across many topics. They discussed the future of military service, changes in warfare, the importance of mental health support for veterans, and the bonds that connected soldiers across generations and nations. Each man contributed from his own experience, and each learned from the others as the meeting drew to a close. Colonel Harrison reached into his bag and pulled out 2 items. The first was a coin, a challenge coin from his unit in Iraq. He gave it to Thomas, saying that Thomas was now part of a brotherhood that transcended specific units or countries. The second item was a book, a collection of letters from soldiers throughout history. He gave this to James, saying it might provide perspective and inspiration. Before they parted, the colonel said something that James would remember forever. He said that their chance meeting at Buckingham Palace had been one of the most meaningful moments of his long military career. It had reminded him why he had chosen this life, why service mattered, and why human connections were more important than any protocol or tradition. The colonel explained that he had been struggling with his own demons before coming to London. The injuries that had ended his combat career still bothered him, not just physically, but emotionally. He missed being in the field, missed the sense of purpose that came with direct action. Standing guard at Buckingham Palace, even briefly, had given him a connection to that sense of purpose again. James and Thomas said goodbye to Colonel Harrison that evening, with promises to stay in touch. As they walked back through the streets of London, both brothers were quiet, processing everything they had heard and shared. The meeting had been more than just a friendly gathering. It had been a healing experience, a moment where three soldiers from different backgrounds found common ground in their shared humanity. Over the following months, the connections between James, Thomas, and Colonel Harrison deepened. They formed a small network of support, checking in with each other regularly, sharing victories and struggles, and offering advice when asked. The colonel introduced them to other veterans he knew, expanding their circle of understanding and support. James noticed that his approach to his duties continued to evolve. He was still precise and professional, still dedicated to maintaining the highest standards of the Queen's Guard, but now he also saw his role differently. He was not just a symbol or a tradition. He was a human being doing a job that mattered. And part of that job was understanding that perfection was not about never needing help, but about knowing when to accept it. He began mentoring younger guards who joined the unit, sharing not just technical knowledge but also wisdom about mental health, dealing with pressure, and maintaining relationships outside of military service. Several young guards told him that his mentorship had made their transition into the role much easier. Thomas continued his recovery and eventually started working with a veterans organization in Yorkshire. He used his own experiences to help other soldiers transitioning back to civilian life. Sharing his story and showing others that recovery was possible had given him a sense of purpose he thought he had lost forever. The story of the American colonel and the British guardsman continued to circulate online. Each time the photos resurfaced on social media, James received messages from people around the world sharing how the story had affected them. Some messages came from veterans who said the story had inspired them to seek help they had been avoiding. Others came from active duty soldiers who said it reminded them why they served. One particularly touching message came from the little girl who had placed the flower at Colonel Harrison's feet. Her mother wrote to thank James, explaining that her daughter talked about that day constantly and wanted to grow up to be a soldier who helped people. Witnessing kindness between soldiers had taught her daughter an important lesson about compassion and service. James shared this message with Colonel Harrison, who responded with a photo of the pressed flower, now carefully preserved in a frame alongside the photograph of Specialist Martinez. The colonel wrote that these two items sat on his desk as daily reminders of why service mattered. One represented the future, the innocence embodied by a child. The other represented the past, the sacrifice and memory of a fallen brother. A year after the incident, James was invited to speak at a military conference about leadership and mental health. He was nervous about public speaking, but Colonel Harrison encouraged him, saying his story needed to be heard. Thomas offered to attend for support, and James accepted gratefully. The conference was attended by military personnel from multiple countries. James told his story simply and honestly. He talked about standing guard, about the American colonel who asked for his post, about the decision to accept help, and about how that single moment had changed his life and his brother's life. He spoke about the importance of creating environments where soldiers felt safe asking for help. Where vulnerability was seen as strength rather than weakness, the response was overwhelming. After his presentation, dozens of officers approached him with their own stories of struggle and recovery. Several said they had been contemplating starting similar support programs in their own units, but had worried about how it would be received. James's story gave them the courage to move forward. One officer, a woman from the Canadian military, told James that she had lost 2 soldiers to suicide in the past year. Both had been struggling but refused help because they thought it would make them appear weak. She said that if her unit had the kind of support structure James described, those soldiers might still be alive. She asked for his advice, and James shared everything he had learned. Colonel Harrison attended the conference and sat in the audience during James's presentation. Afterward, he told James how proud he was, how far James had come from that morning at Buckingham Palace. The colonel said that James had taken a small moment and turned it into a movement, that his willingness to be vulnerable had created ripples touching lives around the world. The conference led to new opportunities for James. He was asked to consult with military units across Europe about mental health initiatives. He worked with psychiatrists and counselors to develop programs that addressed the unique challenges faced by military personnel. Through all of this, James maintained his duties with the Queen's Guard. But now his service extended beyond standing at attention. Thomas became involved in the work as well. He started speaking at schools and community centers about his experiences in Afghanistan and his recovery journey. He was honest about his struggles with PTSD, about the dark times when he had considered ending his life, and about how accepting help had saved him. Young people responded to his authenticity. The brothers worked together on several projects, combining James's insider perspective on military culture with Thomas's experience as a veteran transitioning to civilian life. They co-authored an article for a military journal about the importance of peer support networks and developed a workshop that could be adapted for different military units. 2 years after the incident at Buckingham Palace, James received notification that he was being awarded a special commendation for his work on military mental health initiatives. The awards ceremony was scheduled to take place at the palace. In the very spot where he had given up his post to Colonel Harrison, James invited both Thomas and Colonel Harrison to attend. The colonel rearranged several important meetings to be there, saying he would not miss it for anything. Thomas took time off from his work with the Veterans Organization and traveled to London. The ceremony was attended by senior military officials from Britain and several allied countries. James stood at attention as his commanding officer read the commendation, detailing how his initiatives had helped hundreds of soldiers and had been adopted by units across multiple nations. The officer spoke about how one moment of accepting help had sparked a movement that was literally saving lives. When the medal was pinned to James's uniform, he looked out at the small audience and saw Colonel Harrison and Thomas standing together, both wearing their dress uniforms, both standing at attention and respect. In that moment, James understood the full impact of what had happened 2 years earlier. It had not been about him giving up his post. It had been about 3 soldiers finding each other at exactly the right moment. It's about human connection transcending protocol and pride. After the ceremony, there was a small reception. James stood with Colonel Harrison and Thomas, and they reflected on everything that had happened. The colonel said he had come to London 2 years ago carrying the weight of loss and injury, questioning whether his service still mattered. Meeting James had reminded him that service took many forms. Thomas said he had been drowning in guilt and pain, unable to see a path forward. James's letter about accepting help from the colonel had thrown him a lifeline, as the sun set over London that evening. 3 soldiers from different countries stood together at Buckingham Palace. They had learned that true strength came not from standing alone, but from knowing when to lean on others and when to offer support. James returned to his duties with the Queen's Guard, continuing to stand his post with pride and dedication. But he never forgot that morning. Never forgot the colonel who taught him that accepting help was strength. Never forgot how one moment of vulnerability had changed everything. And every time he stood at attention, he remembered that he was not standing alone. Together, they were stronger than any one of them could be alone.